Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hi, it's Zoe. I'm wondering, have you ever been on a submarine? Have you ever thought what it would be like to live and work on one in such confined quarters and extreme environments without any contact with family for months on end? Have you ever imagined being the leader, the commander of such a craft in such extreme circumstances? The pressure, the intimacy, the challenges. Well, wonder no more, because my guest today is Peter Scott. He spent 34 years in the Australian military, mostly in the submarine arm, the head of the Navy's elite, he calls it. He was Commodore, and he retired in 2017, just a few years ago, and has moved on to become an executive coach. And he's reflected over the course of his amazing career about the key insights of what it takes to lead in such difficult circumstances. So in this conversation today, we dive into a lot of the ins and outs of that. What do we do with power? What do we do about loyalty and trust? Some big picture concepts in leadership informed by extreme conditions. Now, a couple of other things you need to know about him is that he holds a master's in coaching psychology from the University of Sydney. And he is a veteran of multiple special operations with the submarine arm. He saw war service in Iraq, the Persian Gulf, and Afghanistan during 2006 and 2007. He was also awarded a commendation for distinguished service in the Australia Day Honours List in 2008, having previously been decorated with the Conspicuous Service Cross for achievements in command of HMAS Collins. So he's amazing, very humble, very insightful leader, and I'm delighted to bring him to you. Let's do it. Peter Scott, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's so good to have you here. Welcome.
Yeah, Zoe, thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Now, I've never interviewed somebody who has lived and worked on a submarine before, and I'm not sure how many people listening have either. So I'm desperate to find out about what it's all about. How did you actually decide to go, first of all, to go into the Navy and then to embrace submarines?
Yeah, sure. So for me, it was a pretty natural calling perhaps to go into the Navy. As I look back on it, I was, I think, heavily influenced by some great male role models in my family. So I had a grandfather who fought at Villers-Bretonneux in the First World War, an uncle who fought with the Air Force in New Guinea, an uncle who was a priest throughout his life, and my dad was a public servant throughout his life. So all examples to me of people looking to live, an honourable life and a life of service. And there might have been a little bit of me keen to get away and do something different, and the Navy seemed to sort of match that. So off I went at the age of 17.
17 into the Navy. Oh my goodness. And how long was it before you were, getting on a submarine and doing that part of your career?
The first time I went on board a submarine was actually in that first year down at the Naval College. It was a boat had come into the bay, down at Jarvis Bay. And I was one of a couple of guys who were running the boat out to the submarine with whatever it was that they needed. And while we were out there, they lured, is the term I'd probably use, lured us onto the submarine, these young midshipmen. And I was just astounded by probably my inability to comprehend the environment that I was inside that submarine. They look so incredibly sleek, simple and uncomplicated from the outside, but the moment you get in, everything is very hard, very cold, very close, very complex, and really difficult to make sense of what you're seeing, feeling, doing. So that probably wasn't a very attractive first introduction, but it was my first. I made a very deliberate decision to go into submarines probably 4 or 5 years later. And by that stage, I'd been in the mob for a while, seen a little bit. Importantly, I had met my wife-to-be, And I kind of started realising that life in the Navy wasn't going to be all beer and skittles. And I decided that if I was going to commit to this, then I'd make it worth the sacrifice, and I would find the most effective way that I could contribute. And for me, that was submarines. It was the mid-'80s, so on the back of the Falklands War, which is dating me a little bit. But, I had images in my head of the Belgrano being sunk by Conqueror, and, just that very dramatic, definitive example of naval power. And I thought, right, we got boats, I'll give that a go.
Well, beautiful and fascinating story. And I love how you dropped in, this naval power piece. And we're going to talk about power today because I'm curious about how that works in a leadership context and your observations of it. Coming backwards a little bit to your first experience of a submarine and how complex it was and how cold it was. I was surprised to hear that it was cold. Can I ask about that first of all? Why is it cold? Is it because it's submerged in water, or this is just a very basic question? I know.
So no, it is, but it goes to the sort of environment that you live in, and to be honest, not always cold. So depending on, you hit the nail on the head. The water that is surrounding the submarine is very important to the temperature of the submarine. So if you're operating in the tropics, your battle is to keep the submarine as cool as possible. If you're operating, in sub-Antarctic waters or something, then you've got the opposite challenge. But you need a reasonable temperature in there, not, to be honest, so much for the people, but for the equipment. So, the sonars, the combat systems, the radars, all that stuff is operating and needs to be at a stable and reasonable temperature to operate well. And there's a lot of dynamics on board. So, the submarines that we operate are diesel-electric submarines. So they've got very powerful diesel generators, which we run to charge up a main storage battery, and then we operate quite quietly, drawing on the power of the main storage battery. But those generators kick out a hell of a lot of heat, and that sort of permeates through the boat as well. So, the environment can actually change from the front of the boat to the middle to the back. It's not a pleasant environment.
Well, it sounds very industrial and contained, obviously, because you're enclosed and you've got to have everything you use, consume as a human, gets recirculated and repurposed and stored and processed on this tiny little ship thing, which doesn't get to, breathe very much. The complexity of it all. So you said one of your first impressions was how complex it was. And all I've got is my imagination, not ever having been on a sub before. So I'm imagining there's a part of the submarine is the command center where you have your radars and all that kind of stuff. There's places where people sleep. There's the engine rooms, and it's all in a linear fashion. You don't have like an airplane off. Well, I guess it is like an airplane. You don't have rooms off to the side, so to speak. It's down, up and down, right?
Yeah, so everything's forward to aft, depending on the size of the submarine. So certainly the Collins boats have got a couple of decks in different parts of the boat. So it will be structured different ways. So something like the engine room, it is very industrial. That's a great description of it. Something like the engine room is one big space because it's got to contain these very large pieces of machinery. Something like the fore ends, the front of the boat, which is where the torpedoes are stored, is also one very large space, but it's kind of broken up with torpedo racks and storage and stowage and so on. Other parts are really quite compartmented. So accommodation spaces are quite, compact, 3 bunks on this side, 3 bunks on this side, all stacked on top of each other, little passageway in between.
So no room to yourself on a submarine?
Some, but very little. Your bunk is your bunk, and it's the only piece of the submarine that's yours. But even then, so as a junior officer, before I was qualified, we would sleep up in the fore ends, up underneath or above the torpedoes. That was our bedroom. So no privacy there at all. And then, funnily enough, the more senior you get, if you're riding a submarine to do an assessment or something, you don't have your own bunk, you're back up in the fore ends. Occasionally, you would, depending on how many people are on board, you might need to hot bunk. So the bunk might be yours when you're off watch, but somebody else's when you're on watch. So they're just sort of levels and degrees of an absence of privacy. But it's remarkable, I think, how tolerant people can be and how respectful people can be, even when there's very little opportunity for genuine privacy or whatever. It becomes really important, and therefore really, people honour other people's private space as they can offer it, if that makes sense.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. And I've got a great visual of what that life is like now. Just one other logistical question. So communications with family, can you communicate with your family while you're on a sub? And is that through phone, through sat phone, through internet? How does that work?
So, no. So one of the key attributes and really the great strength of a submarine is its ability to operate with stealth, for it to be somewhere and no one understand what's happening around it, but not to be seen, not to be heard. So preservation of that stealth it kind of drives everything. It depends on the tactical situation. Literally, if we're sailing in and out of harbour and I'm on the bridge, I might get on the phone and call the headquarters or something. But typically and classically, once we are at sea, we operate very independently. So we will be able to receive communications from our headquarters. But if we're operating and trying to remain undetected, so on an operation, not on an exercise, then we won't be transmitting at all. So you're certainly not making family phone calls back home to the family. You're not even sending back situation reports to the headquarters. Now, there is an exception to that. So we can receive communications when we're out at sea, and they're sort of broadcast blind to us. And there's a system called familygrams. So before you sail, you'll give your family a little booklet, and literally they can choose from a menu of number 1, I love you, number 10, dog ate the cat, whatever, and they can build a little story, but they're quite limited literally in the number of characters that they can send.
Yeah, right.
So you might be away for 8 weeks at sea, you might receive 1 or 2 familygrams saying happy birthday or whatever it might be, but it can be very, very isolated in that regard.
Yeah, that's a major project and a lifestyle commitment to undergo. When you're talking about privacy and stealth, I get it now. Thank you for sharing that. That was really, really helpful. And I think that sort of sets the context for your immersive career and observations of leadership, because it is a very particular context. It's not the same context that business leaders necessarily play in. And yet the leadership insights are really translatable. And I think you've got a lot to offer there. And thank you so much for sharing your command paper with me. And we'll make available to everybody the publicly available link to that paper. That'll be in the show notes for people, so that people can go and read all your words of wisdom about your experience in command. And based on that paper and our conversations to date, there's a couple of questions I want to ask from a leadership point of view. And we did mention power, and I think that's a useful place to start. So, power is part of command, and there's different aspects of it. There's authority, accountability, responsibility, and those are all quite different things, really, though they're related. When you have command, how do you avoid traps of power? Or that's one aspect of the question. And affiliated with that, how does power play out? How have you seen power play out in command as a Commodore?
Sure. So there's definitely traps out there. And, one of the ways that I describe command at sea, and it goes to that very independent style of operation, command at sea in a submarine in particular, it is leadership with ultimate authority and accountability. You can do anything out there, but you're going to be held accountable for it as well. And you are operating exceptionally independently. When you're out there on an operation, the submarine CEO effectively is the Navy, as far as the people on board are concerned. So the authority is very real. You have at your disposal some tremendous destructive power, if nothing else. So the responsibilities are pretty heavy as well. And the decisions you make will impact on yourself, your people, your submarine. In my view, you need to be careful to honour the responsibilities and the accountabilities very fully and be continually assessing your decisions for consequence and alternatives. I think one of the traps of power is to be overtaken by the power. And for myself, I've always found it really important to just know who you are, both with the uniform and without the uniform. Because all the people in your submarine are people with a uniform and people without a uniform as well. So to avoid hubris, I think there's two other H words that are important. One is humility and one is humanity.
Humility and humanity.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they both kind of go to connections. So for me, my family have always kept me very grounded. If they ever saw my head getting too swollen, bang, they'd pop it in a good way, So they've always helped me to stay grounded and humble. And I think the other side of that is the humanity piece and being connected to others, having genuine connections with the people that you're leading and the people that you're serving. And I think if you're connected in those ways, then that's the best way to avoid getting overwhelmed with your own power, self-importance.
I can imagine that it's very tempting in an environment where you are autonomous by nature of the work. You're a self-contained unit by design because of the stealth nature of your job. Have you ever seen it get derailed by the power traps where a commander or a commodore or a leader on the ship just lost the plot from a power point of view?
Yeah, so it definitely happens. I think over time, culturally, we've become better at setting up an environment where that's less likely to happen. In our discussions earlier, we spoke a little bit about David Marquette book. So he's a USN submarine commander who's written a really good book about leadership in that circumstance.
Yeah, the book is called Turn the Ship Around, and I think he's got another book called Leadership is Language.
Right, yep, he does. So I know a lot of USN officers. Another officer who I've actually met is a fellow by the name of Commander Scott Waddle. And he speaks about his experience where it went wrong. So he was in a command of a submarine called the USS Greenville. In a certain circumstance, she surfaced in emergency, but she came up underneath a Japanese fishing vessel off Hawaii, sank the fishing vessel and killed 9 people. The subsequent Board of Inquiry focused a lot on the command environment there. And it was absolutely one in which he was the pinnacle of decision making, and there was very little room for dissent or alternate views or whatever. And he made mistakes that a number of people in the crew could have picked up and should have picked up, but did not voice their concerns because of the environment that he created there. So, yeah, if it goes wrong, it goes wrong in a big way.
I think that's a really useful leadership observation, right? So if you are the linchpin, every decision has to be signed off by you. You got issues with control and power in that situation, and you're creating such a roadblock and a rod for your own back in doing so. How do you go about developing your people so that they feel able to make decisions and or challenge the leadership? Because it's not easy. If somebody's got authority over you, like you can feel like your job and career are at stake here.
Yeah. And classically, it is a very hierarchical environment. We're split into very deliberate ranks. It might, in fact, be one of the reasons that I found my way to submarines is that the rank structure on the boats is actually, like, it's still there, but it's a lot flatter than you might find in a destroyer or something else like that. And that's partly because of the way we work. It's partly because it's not a huge crew. You can get away with it. But it might be that the person with the critical piece of information is the most junior guy on board who needs to put up his hand and say, hey, Captain, I don't think you've hoisted in, this guy's really close, or whatever. So how to do that, I think it starts with ensuring your people understand what they are responsible for and what they are accountable for, and ensuring they are clear that you expect them to do their job.
Can we just clarify those two words? Because I think they often get mishmashed together. So in your point of view, when you're dealing with a junior colleague or any colleague and you're trying to identify, you are responsible, this means blah. You're accountable, this means blah. How do you explain it to people?
I would explain it as you're responsible. This is your task. Your task is to work the sonar, analyse the sonar, make critical calls about what you're seeing or what you're hearing there. That's what you're responsible for. I'm going to hold you accountable for how well you do that job. So if you do that job well, tick. If you cannot explain, why you failed to detect a contact or classify a contact or whatever, cross. So it's about, this is the job I expect you to do. This is you accounting for your performance in that role with those responsibilities.
Yeah, okay. So it's about who wears the consequences. So ideally, if you have a task to do, you wear the consequences for doing that task well or not. Ultimately, as you said, though, if you're the Commodore of a submarine, you wear ultimate accountability for the whole box and dice.
Right. Because you're the guy who's set up the environment. You're the guy who's got the most experience. You're the guy who's responsible for the overall outcome. Yep.
Yeah. I'd love to hear about your definition of success and how to deal with failure. So this is a two-barrel question, right? So as a leader, how do you personally define success? And in that, how have you dealt with failure in the past?
Sure. So I think we're pretty fortunate in an organisation like the Navy because your mission is defined. It might be complex, but you've got your mission. You achieve your mission, you succeed. You don't achieve your mission, you don't succeed. It can be that sort of black and white. So I think that's probably as simple as I could get to a definition of success in that environment. Failure. Let me give you two examples. They're connected, Zoe. So one would be a conspicuous success that I can talk to. So I was in command of HMAS Collins. We were tasked to take the submarine to Alaska, long way away. We were taking the boat there because the US Navy has an acoustic ranging facility in a canal up in Alaska, and we were mapping the acoustic signature of the submarine. So that was objective number one. But to do that, we had to sail from Perth, underneath Australia, across the Pacific, over to Alaska. We did a lot of things on the way there and on the way back. It ended up as the longest and the farthest deployment ever conducted by an Australian submarine. So 185 days away, 21,000 nautical miles. Most of that dived.
Wow.
And what that did was it really proved the capabilities of the platform. And this was at a time when there was immense doubt about, whether we'd build a successful class of submarine or not. And it was at a time where we had done nothing in that league. So it was an extraordinary step beyond what we'd previously achieved with the boat. So that was a great success. Lots of little successes on the way, but one big success. Wonderful. A great experience for many of the ship's company, a lot of whom, just had never done anything like that before. So, I don't know, success is pretty easy to deal with, I think. Failure, in the months immediately prior to that deployment, I ran my submarine aground.
What? Oh, oops.
Yep, oops. Yep.
Ooh.
We were at depth and at speed, and I drove the submarine into the continental shelf. 65 men and women on board at the time, so, literally risking the submarine and all of their lives. Now, that came about, we were at the very end of preparations for that really big deployment. And we invest a lot of time and a lot of energy in training and preparing submarines and submarine crews for whatever it is that they're going to go away and do. So we're at the back of a 3-month workup, is what we call it. It was the final night of that workup. We were just about home and we'd been working against other ships and aircraft I think we just attacked the task group, went deep to evade, and overnight we were closing the coast to do an inshore operation off Rottnest Island, for those who know it, the following morning. But we buggered it up and we stoofed into the continental shelf. So that was a failure. Dealing with that, Navy has its own way of dealing with that sort of stuff. So there was a very formal board of inquiry. It was convened a couple of days after we got back alongside. And I remember deciding I had to have a conversation with my officers who would be called up before this board of inquiry beforehand. We were a very tight unit, and I knew, so my career was absolutely on the line. As I walked off to go to that board of inquiry, I didn't know if I was going to be walking back on or not, but we were very close, and I knew that there would be an inclination or a temptation for people to protect me, and I also had an inclination to protect my people. But it wasn't what was important. What was important was that we expose the truth, whatever that truth was, and then deal with, that reality. Because if we didn't do that, we would learn nothing and we'd be no better off. So that conversation was just about, hey, the way to be loyal here is just to honour the truth. Just say it as you saw it and heard it, and lay it all out there, and what comes will come.
That's a really powerful experience, and it would have been terrifying. And what great insight! I love the fact that you say the way to be loyal here is to honor the truth. And so often you think to be loyal is to cover over each other and back each other, as opposed to leaning into the truth and finding out how we did this. And I noticed how you said, I drove the submarine into the continental shelf. It wasn't you alone on the submarine, but you own it.
Well, that's that ultimate piece. Yep.
Yeah. So fundamentally, what did you discover was the lesson in that?
So there were some fundamental things just with how the navigation plan was implemented, which I won't go into the detail of. But for me, it was a lesson in truly understanding where my people were at. So I think I made the error so at the end of that whole 3-month workup, we're all pretty tired. We're all on edge. But in my mind, I'd kind of convinced myself that if I could, come up with the right scheme for approaching the coast and write the detailed orders and speak through those with the guys, if I had the wit and the energy to do that, then they had the wit and the energy to execute it. But fundamentally, they were all much more fatigued than I was, not the least because they'd been working harder than I had. For many of these guys, it was the first experience of going through that sort of an operational workup. I'd been through scores of them before. And I misplaced my capacity with theirs. I confused the two. So I set them up.
I think that's a really important insight, and this goes across all leadership roles, I think, is that I often think of it's the reverse. The leader at the top has the most burdens to bear and wears the most stress. And in some cases, that's true. And yet there is a cost, or I guess there's still some privileges that give us some leeway as leaders. Like, yeah, we have pressure and responsibility, but, and there's deliberate use of the word but, we get to make the calls. And that sense of autonomy and control is actually an energy booster. And I love how you point out that if you are on the receiving end of instructions, you have less autonomy in your world in some way, shape, or form. And if your people are just learning their role, they've got the energy required to learn the role and execute it. And they don't have experience on their side, so they don't know what they're capable and what their thresholds are. Yeah, it's interesting to think that those who are not in positions of authority can actually be more exhausted than those at the top. And I never really thought of that before until we've had this conversation about it. It's like, who gets more tired? Like, what is more tiring? And what kind of impact does that have on people's performance? I think that's really, really super important. So thank you so much for sharing that insight. I think that's fantastic. When it comes to leadership philosophy, and you've been hinting at it and describing it in some ways, do you have a particular leadership philosophy, and does it differ from your peers, or is there a common thread across naval commanders?
I think if you just looked at naval officers writ large, you'd see a pretty consistent, homogenous style of leadership. But there's definitely variation, and I think it varies across two main dimensions. One is personality and ability, and the other is context. And obviously, you need to be able to vary across those two. I think for myself, if I was to pinch down on it, I'd say that I have a leadership philosophy of empowerment and delegation. And it's kind of easy to say, but I think it comes down to being able to really clearly articulate and express your expectations. We did touch on it before, Zoe, help people understand what are they responsible for, and they better understand that because they are going to be held accountable for the outcomes and their performance there. But what that does is it gives people ownership of their stuff, which is really important. I think from a leadership perspective, there's a couple of traps in there around trust and risk. So if you genuinely know and understand the capabilities of your people, what knowledge they have, what skills they have, what experience they have, how they're motivated, you know what to trust them with, and you can delegate appropriately. And the risk bit comes into the context. So it's not just what you can trust them with, but what you can trust them with in a certain circumstance. And if you don't understand the context for them, then you're not going to be aware of the things that are threatening you or the mission, and therefore you're not able to adequately assess the risk. So I think with those two dimensions, knowing what you can trust and knowing what risks you face, then you can delegate appropriately and give people the right amount of responsibility and hold them accountable for that. So I look to, particularly if I'm joining a new team in a leadership role, I look to be very clear about my expectations, but I look to deliver my expectations with a sense of trust and faith and confidence that this is what I expect, but I also expect you can deliver. So off you go. But then I spend whatever time and energy is necessary to make sure that I do accurately understand what they're capable of in a given circumstance, and that I'm always calibrating that delegation piece.
I think it's really important that you raise this topic of trust, and it's something that comes up a lot with leaders, particularly in this hybrid work environments. And the conversation has been for the last year and a half around how can I trust people when they're working from home? I don't have oversight of what they're doing. And the way that you've defined it is completely different. It's not about can I see what they're doing? It's more how well do I know their abilities, and how well do I know their abilities within different contexts. And I think that's so useful. Like it's not about do I trust them or not. It's how well do I know them? Therefore, I know that they can perform in A, B, or C context. D, we don't know, and therefore that's a risk to assess.
Right. So just to link that, the sort of COVID situation, work from home piece, in a submarine, we might go away for 2 months. There might be people in the ship's company who I do not see in that time.
What?
Even in a tiny submarine. Because typically I live and work in my cabin, eat in the wardroom mess, and most of my working day will be in a control room. There'll be people who live and work in the junior rates mess and work down aft. And, they're on the submarine, but I can't see them doing their work. I just have to trust that they're back there doing their stuff and they're doing it well. I'll find out if they're not. But even with that proximity, you've got to be able to trust that people know their stuff and are getting on and doing their stuff. Another example would be the sonar guy. I can't hear what the sonar guy can hear. So I just got to trust that he's making the sense of it that he can make of it.
I think underneath that, though, I mean, it's less about the reason that you can trust people is because A, you know their skill level and their ability, and you've assessed that thoroughly. And B, you've got really good systems in place. And so what you're trusting is the skill within a system. And the systems there, as you said, oh, if they're not doing it, I will find out. So there's a feedback loop in the system to indicate whether or not things are off or on and working correctly. And I think that analogy is really useful in a mainstream business context. And I think that's the important piece that I would want leaders to pick up on, is that trust is a currency, but it's a byproduct of all the other things that you do. Knowing your people well and having systems in place that allow them to do their job and to have a feedback loop, and when they perform and when they don't perform. And so that's where the trust is based, I think, as opposed to this blanket, there's this human in front of me, do I trust them or not? And it becomes like a personality judgment if we don't put these frameworks on it. And I think that's a big mistake.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool. What do you think of loyalty? And you mentioned this before, like when you were up on this big investigation, you've run your submarine into the ground, and you said we were very close and I was worried about misplaced loyalty. How do you define or think of loyalty in leadership?
Right. So a simple piece, but a really important one, is it's very definitely a two-way dynamic. And in a position of power, it can be easy to just think of loyalty as a one-way dynamic. Are my people being loyal to me? But it's absolutely a two-way dynamic. It's not unidirectional. I think you mentioned currency. The currency of the relationship can be important. In the environments I've always worked in, there's always been a sort of values base to that and a shared purpose around our endeavours. So in many ways, loyalty in those environments goes beyond the sort of person to person, and it goes to the, yes, I'm loyal to you because we're both loyal to the submarine, or yes, I'm loyal to you because we're both loyal to naval service or that other bigger thing. And there needs to be an ethical dimension to loyalty. Just blind loyalty is what will get you into trouble. Considered loyalty is kind of what you want to aim for.
Considered loyalty. What do you mean by considered loyalty?
Well, I guess I mean it's loyalty within context. It's loyalty within other considerations, perhaps. Yes, I'm loyal to this cause, but if it's going to break my health or break my family, then that's a consideration about, am I misplacing my loyalty, for example.
Got it.
So it's just thoughtful loyalty rather than maybe compulsive loyalty or loyalty for the sake of it, feeling good or whatever.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, we couldn't talk to a retired naval commodore of submarines without talking about submarines. And we're in Australia, and right now there's a bit of a submarine scandal happening. For those who are listening outside of Australia, what happened is that Australia had a big purchase order, if you like, from the French government for these conventional styled submarines to the tune of, I think, 90 billion. It's quite a bit of change. And then recently, the Australian government said, nah, we won't go with the French. We're going to actually do a deal with the Americans and the British. And the French are a little bit put out by that. And they pulled their ambassador out of Australia, and it's been a very massive international stoush. So, as somebody who is in the Navy and commanding submarines, I want to know what you think about all that from a leadership point of view. And I understand you won't necessarily have carte blanche to talk about the ins and outs of it, but I'd love to hear whatever you have to say on that issue.
Sure. So certainly in my past life, I was involved in the lead up to the decision to work with the French as our partner for the design and construction of that next class of submarine. And it was moving along as it needed to do. I was not involved in the most recent decision, which I would describe as a monumental decision in the scheme of Australian submarines. So that decision was, I'd probably characterise it not as turning away from the French and towards the British and the Americans, but as a decision to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. So I spoke earlier, Zoe, about we've always operated conventional submarines, diesel-electric propulsion systems. Nuclear-powered submarines have some tremendous advantage just with respects to dive speed and endurance and capacity. So the way I'd kind of describe it is, the government has now made a decision that brings government direction on our requirement into line with our actual geographic and geostrategic needs. So we've always needed nuclear-powered submarines. There just hasn't been a government policy position that would allow us to have them. So we've, worked with the best that we could on conventional style submarines.
So politics aside, you think nuclear subs are a good thing? You're happy about that?
Look, I think the capability absolutely matches what we need from a defence perspective. And it just goes to size and scale of our country, size and scale of the Indo-Pacific. Submarines, conventional or nuclear powered, kind of doesn't matter for us. They're our principal strategic deterrent. They are the thing that will have someone else thinking twice about giving us a punch in the nose. So it is a really important capability in that regard. And, the nuclear-powered platform just has greater punch, basically. So it matches.
So technical decision, got it, understood. The political sphere, have you got any words to say about that?
Look, I think you can see I'm hesitating. We've had very strong alliances with the British and the Americans forever. The alliance there is strong, is enduring. There's not really a change in working with them on this solution. I think with the French, they have enduring interests in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. We have shared continued interests in those regions. And I can understand the French being upset with this decision, but I also think it's something that we'll be able to move through strategically over time.
Okay, I'll take that. Take that as fairly diplomatic response. And I mean, leadership in that on an international stage is quite a complex thing. And, and as it affects the people on the ground or in the tube, I'm not sure what you call a submarine. Do you call it, what do you call it? Do you have a nickname for a sub?
They're generally referred to as boats. So
Really?
You've got to be careful calling a warship a boat. People get upset about that, but submarines are generally referred to as boats. I think it probably comes from, the undersea boat of the German navies, the undersea boats. They're just commonly known as boats.
What is that noise? Have you got like a garbage truck reversing down your lane or something?
Yeah. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Just wanted to point that out in case people are going, what is going on? Oh, that's the joys of...
Not normally here at this time of day.
So be it. It's all right. So you left the Navy in 2017 and you've embarked on a completely different career, human-based, people-based one, as an executive coach. What's your focus these days?
So, I've made that transition and I'm working as an executive coach. Some of the coaching that I do is actually back into Navy, so coaching some senior executives in there, which I really enjoy. It's just a great way to stay connected and continue to sort of help and contribute there. Otherwise, I coach out into corporate, a partial focus on defence sector and defence industry, just because it's the crowd that I know and understand, and I don't pretend to have defence industry business expertise, but I can certainly relate to their challenges. And what I look to do, what I tell myself and tell others that I do is I unleash the courage and the compassion and the wisdom of leaders. So I think that's the best way for me to utilise my experience and my knowledge, is to help others to tap into those things and and contribute in that way to their success.
I love it. So you're speaking my language: compassion, courage, and wisdom. Absolutely what I aspire to help leaders with as well. So I think that's fantastic that you're doing that great work built on such a long history of command in the military, where under really challenging circumstances, you've learned a thing or two. You've also got a book coming out. When can we expect to see it?
So I've drafted a manuscript of a memoir. I'm on the hunt for a publisher. So I don't know the answer to that question, Zoe, but when I get a publisher, I'll let you know how we're going.
Good. Well, when you do get a publisher and you have a date, let us know, and we'll let everybody listening to the show know about it too. In the meantime, where can people find out more about you?
So I do have a little website, www.peter-scott.com.au.
Yeah. So we'll have a link to your website and a link to your command paper. And when your book comes out, we'll pop that in there too. Peter, this has been absolutely fascinating. It's a world that I know nothing about and have zero experience of, and I've always been fascinated by it. So any movie that comes out about submarine control and command and adventures, then I'm like, oh, let's watch that. And so it's fantastic to meet maybe this is a good question to end on then, actually. Do you have a favorite submarine-related movie that you would recommend?
Das Boot.
What? Das Boot.
So Das Boot, yeah. So German production, The Boat. I will sit through the director's cut. It's very long. It's actually a hard watch because it's the reason I like it is it's a wartime movie set on a German submarine, but it actually comes quite close to actual environment on a submarine on operations. It's a long way away from a Hunt for Red October or whatever.
I would thought for sure you'd say Hunt for Red October, but that's
Hollywood.
Hollywood. Okay, Das Boot is the more realistic thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, awesome. Peter, thank you so much for your book recommendations, your film recommendations, and to sharing the wealth of knowledge that you have from an amazing career. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks for your time, and thank you to your audience.
Wow, that was absolutely fascinating. I've always been curious about life and work and leadership in such difficult circumstances in a place like on a submarine. And maybe because I've immersed in my novel, which has got a similar context in terms of living in confined spaces. It's a futuristic science fiction novel. But here's a man who's lived and breathed it for 34 years with other people with lessons learned along the way. I think probably one of the big takeaways for me, and it's sort of sticking with me, is this idea of how leaders experience stress or metabolize it in a different way. And often we think that our people are keeping up with us. And yet the people on the front lines often carry more stress and get more challenged by circumstances than us. We might have more experience, we might have more autonomy, more control, and therefore can handle the pressures a little bit differently. And our people might be struggling and trailing behind us. And to remember always to think about the people around us and what they are experiencing and not project our own experience onto them. I think that was a really brilliant insight, along with many others in this wonderful conversation. I'd love to hear what your insights are. You can email me at zoe@zoerouth.com and share them, or you can pop them into our Facebook page or on LinkedIn, wherever it is. I'd love to hear from you. It's always wonderful to hear from podcast listeners. And if you want to expand your leadership abilities and really step up and lean into leading in difficult circumstances, expanding your point of view, becoming more influential so that you can have bigger and better results year after year, then Amplifiers might be for you. It's our flagship course for CEOs and managing directors from across sectors. They're big thinkers with big hearts who want to make a big difference. And it is my absolute joy to work with these people in a collective environment where we lean into some big picture leadership concepts and put them into practice over a 90-day period as an experiment. Okay, if you're interested and curious, come along and find out more. Just go to zoerouth.com, click on programs, click on amplifiers, and you can find out more about that. Or just sing out direct. I would love to chat with you. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.